chapters 11 to 13. This is chapter 11, Blazing Pumpkin. With homecoming behind us, Halloween began to happen 2 weeks early. Soaked windows and pinned car horns and lawn furniture up in trees and dead cats on porches. Unknown hands put a brooder house, complete with a flock of hens inside, on the railroad tracks. The Norfolk and Western evening St. Louis train hit it broadside. There was kindling and chicken parts on every roof in town. Trees dripped giblets, and there was hen grit everywhere. Halloween began early, but then so did Mrs. Dowdle. When it came to the future, she was always a step ahead. There were two schools of thought about her. One was that greasing her porch steps or tearing down her privy wasn't a real good idea. On the other hand, nobody had yet dug up treasure of cash money wherever it was buried. As usual, she seemed to pay no heed to public opinion. She and Ruth Ann even carved a giant pumpkin. They'd scooped it out, baked some pies and a few loaves of pumpkin bread. Now it stood blazing with candles every night on the Dowdle front steps, daring anybody to knock it off. On Halloween night, Dad took Ruth Ann out to ring a few doorbells and collect some treats. He had calls to pay on shut-ins anyway. For a costume, Ruth Ann wanted to go as an Indian princess, but Dad talked her out of it. In the end, she came downstairs with her trick-or-treat sack, wearing a plaid flannel shirt of mine, her own bedroom slippers, and one of Mother's hats with a veil. "Honey, who are you?" Dad said. "Mrs. Wilcox," she said, crossing her eyes. They left, and I went up to the party at the Grange Hall the 4-H gave to keep us off the streets. It was an okay party with donuts. At least we didn't have to pin the tail on the donkey or bob for apples. Some of the country kids came in for it. I guess you can't do much Halloweening down on the farm. Jess Wood showed up, and there was some corn silk smoke outside behind the trucks. But a few of the 8th graders started a game that could have ended up with kissing, so a bunch of us went home. Jess did, and he could drive his dad's truck himself. Later that night, there was a thumbnail of a moon, a touch of winter in the hazy air. Phyllis and Ruth Ann were both in bed. Phyllis hadn't gone anywhere, being grounded. Ruth Ann had laid out all the treats she'd collected to show Rachel. Now she was sawing logs. I was at my window, still dressed from the party, waiting for whatever could happen next. Something was going to. You could feel it in the air. The giant pumpkin glowed on Mrs. Dowdle's front steps. Above the cob house roof hung the glow of a campfire dying down. Anyone trespassing on her melon patch would see a figure humped in afghans, a shotgun across her knees, sitting guard as promised. Car horns still went off, but far away. Sudden gunfire from right next door would have come as no surprise, of course. It was like Fort Leonard Wood over there. But all was silence until the sudden snap of the kitchen door. A cloud blurred the narrow moon. A large figure crossed the side yard, darker than night except for her white hair. I was downstairs when Dad opened the door. Mrs. Dowdle was on the porch. But how could she be since she was sitting guard out in the melon patch? But here she was, dressed in a complete outfit save from her dead husband. Canvas coat over overalls, gum boots, a flap cap, and hunting gear. "I bagged him," she said to Dad. "Call the law." We had a phone now. We had to. People kept calling on Dad to plan their future funerals. When he turned back to make the call, I slipped out. After all, an old lady shouldn't be out at all hours alone in the dark. The corners of her dim kitchen were crowded with eerie shapes like severed heads, pumpkins too ugly to sell that she was saving for Thanksgiving pies. "Don't worry," she said over her shoulder. "I got him tied up to the leg of the bed." I kept on her heels up the linoleum steps. Her heavy tread rocked the house. Light fell from one of the bedrooms, her grandson Joey's. She filled the doorway, and somebody in there yelped at another side of her. "Turn me loose," a deep, whiny voice said. "I was just trick-or-treating is all I was doing." "With a crowbar and an axe in my upstairs bedroom?" she thundered. "You're looking at doing time, boy, in the state reformatory." The gun hung broken over her canvas sleeve. My heart thudded. Had she nailed him? Had he walked right into her trap through her unlocked front door past a blazing pumpkin? Had she finally got the goods on Roscoe Burdick? I peered around her. There, kicking the bedroom floor on a rag rug between a crowbar and axe, there was his wrist, trussed up behind him, and one ankle tied by fishing line to the leg of the bed. Was Newt Fluke. My heart sank. Mrs. Dowdle had been gunning for Roscoe Burdick, but she'd bagged a Fluke. Who sent you on this particular errand? Nobody, he muttered. I thought it up my own self. You ain't had a thought of your own yet, she remarked. And you know what you are? Newt Fluke dared say from the floor, though his teeth chattered. There was no heat up here. You're a darn witch. How can you be out in your melon patch and up here sitting on this bed waiting for me? How can you be in two places at once? You're a... Boy, she said, I can be in three places if need be. Right about then, we heard the siren on C.P. Snokes' Dodge. I'd kept behind Mrs. Dowdle, trying to be invisible in case Newt ever got out on bail. I was home then, before I was missed. From my window, I watched C.P. Snokes cramming Newt Fluke into the back seat of the squad car. Mrs. Dowdle stood in the headlight glare with her fists on her big hips. She looked about half satisfied. Then when the car door closed on Newt, she said to the police chief, There's another one in my snowballs. She crooked a thumb at her house. Sure enough, another gangly figure exploded out of the snowball bushes by her bay window. He swerved for the road, lighting out for tall timber. They let him go. Around here you can run, but you can't hide. It was Elmo Leeper, Jr. He'd been left to stand guard while Newt went in to dig up the bedroom floor. Halloween was finally petering out as the Dodge reversed into the road. I could hear Dad up in his attic study, trying to get back to his sermon. It must be a Saturday already. Then came a stealthy footfall on the stairs. I cracked my door. Was Phyllis making a break for freedom? But it was Mother. Mother coming up, taking steps. I blinked to be sure. She looked kind of frostbitten, though. She was wearing several Afghans. Weirder still, she carried a shotgun broken open over her arm. I couldn't believe my eyes. Mother? Packing heat? Silent as snow, she made for her room, and the door closed behind her. Mother and Mrs. Dowdle, working hand in glove. I fell back on my bed, dizzy with what grown-ups can get up to. I've drifted off into my usual dream, the one about going down for the third time in Salt Creek, sucking brown water and dragonflies with Roscoe Burdick's heavy hand on my head. But then I slept deeper than the creek into November. Chapter 12. Come, ye thankful people, come. Thanksgiving now and Christmas coming. The last leaves burned in long piles in the ditches. White smoke rose through bare limbs like ancient Kickapoo campfires. The second frost had killed the cannas, so there was nothing between us and Mrs. Dowdle. She was too busy to sit down. Busier than a one-armed paper hanger, she claimed. I'll die standing up like an old ox, she said in another of her sayings. She and Ruth Ann had made up little packets of suet to hang in the trees of the yard for the winter birds, the chickadees and the cardinals. They tied them in red and green ribbons like Christmas presents coming early. Now they were running a big lawn roller for somewhere back and forth to hold the black walnuts carpeting her yard. Walnuts for cookies to come. They'd cut the sage and hung it in bunches from the cob house beams for Thanksgiving dressing. In her kitchen, wherever the pumpkins weren't, were big dough bowls of breadcrumbs drying. For the yard work, Mrs. Dowdle wore a pair of old cotton stockings pulled over her canvas coat sleeves to keep out the draft. Ruth Ann was apt to burst into song while they worked. Jesus wants me for a sunbeam, and we gather together to ask the Lord's blessing. At school, there was a lot of talk about pilgrims. But then there was always this time of year, Mrs. Wiedenbach, the banker's wife, came to our class to tell about how either she or one of her ancestors had come over on the Mayflower. One thing I gave thanks for was that Newt Fluke had been taken out of 6th grade. He wasn't doing time, even though Mrs. Dowdle caught him red-handed. Instead, the coach, who was also the high school principal, promoted Newt to freshman year so he could play out the football season. The coach planned to build a new ground fence around him. And without Newt, Elmo Leeper Jr. wasn't much. In fact, he was kind of lonely. He came over to me one noon and said, "You want to swap lunches?" He held up his bucket. "Mine's peanut butter and grape jelly on Wonder bread." And I did, because mine was corned beef and carrot sticks. For a preacher's family, Thanksgiving is all about feeding the hungry. Mother and the Methodist Women's Circle used the church as a gathering place for the food donations. The church had new, top-of-the-line windows now, combination storms and screens. Moore's IGA store donated turkeys, and the DAR brought canned goods. Mrs. Wiedenbach herself promised her famous candied yams. I had to beg various stores for boxes to pack the dinners in because we'd be delivering to shut-ins. Though Mrs. Dowdle was no church woman, she was in and out of all Thanksgiving week, gradually taking over the entire Methodist Feed the Hungry Thanksgiving campaign. She was everywhere that Mother turned. "Who's baking them turkeys for you?" she demanded to know. When she heard it was Mrs. Pensinger, she said, "Reba Pensinger? Her turkey's dry as the bottom of a canary cage, and you could lubricate your car with her pan gravy. I'll do the birds in my oven. Have this boy bring them to the house," meaning me. Also, she thought very little of cranberry sauce in a can. "I wouldn't slop hogs with it. You could taste the can." A cauldron of bubbling, popping cranberries and orange peel seethed on her stovetop, spiced with cinnamon sticks. As soon as school was over every afternoon, Ruth Ann stood on a kitchen chair and stirred. Since Mrs. Pensinger didn't need oven space for the turkeys, she baked 2 or 3 pumpkin pies and brought them over to the church. But she said her pumpkins had let her down and all the good ones had vanished from her patch. Mrs. Dowdle baked 20 pumpkin pies at least. She showed Ruth Ann how to roll out dough and how to keep a bottom crust from getting soggy in the middle. 3 mountains of dressings grew in her kitchen: chestnut, oyster, and cornbread. The Methodist men volunteered to deliver the dinners on Thanksgiving Day. Brochier's funeral home offered their hearse, but Dad thought it might send the wrong message to people who saw it turning up at their place. Somehow Mrs. Dowdle was in our car with us when we headed out. She hadn't dressed up. She wore a kitchen apron under her hunting jacket. Ruth Ann was in the back seat with her, also a prune. Dad was behind the wheel and sat beside him where I liked to be. The whole pickle smelled like turkey and cranberries and baked this morning Parker House rolls. Mrs. Dowdle gave us the directions to Aunt Madge's house, whoever she was. Mrs. Dowdle had been particular about us calling on Aunt Madge. "Who is she anyway?" Ruth Ann wanted to know. "Is she a poor old widow woman?" "Well, she's poor all right, and she's old as the hills," Mrs. Dowdle pondered. "Though I don't know as you could call her a widow woman. Nobody in that family ever got around to marrying." "Then is she an old maid?" Ruth Ann inquired. "Well, I don't know as you'd call her that either," Mrs. Dowdle muttered. Dad was all ears for whatever he could hear from up front. We spun along a county road through the frosty fields. I watched him work through the gears on the pickle. He was inclined to ride the clutch a little. Mrs. Dowdle reached up to poke his shoulder. "Make a left at the Burma Shave sign, Miss Preacher." We were about 5 miles out now and getting down to 1 lane, and then a track, and then 2 ruts. Up a turning was what looked like a large junkyard, and the fence was down. "Turn up that lane," Mrs. Dowdle directed, and Dad geared down. The house itself lurked low, and the roof was patched with Coca-Cola signs. We all helped carry Aunt Madge's Thanksgiving dinner. "Go on in," Mrs. Dowdle said. "She don't lock up." Inside was a lot like outside, and somewhat colder. You could see your breath. Dad had a duck in the doorway. The floor wasn't all there. Then over by a stove, a pile of rags became an old woman in a lazy boy recliner. "Woo boy," Ruth Ann whispered. "That's the oldest looking woman I ever saw." Mrs. Dowdle nodded. "She's only about 3 years behind me in school." We had to clear a plank table to put down boxes of dinner. The old woman noticed us. She had a long red nose that she kept wiping with a matching bandana. "Get off my place," she greeted. "Clear out." "We brought you your Thanksgiving dinner," Mrs. Dowdle bellowed at her. "My what?" old Aunt Madge said. "It ain't even Thanksgiving." "Yes, it is," Mrs. Dowdle boomed, looming over her. Aunt Madge squinted up. "From the looks of you, it's Halloween." Mrs. Dowdle wore her flat cap. Aunt Madge wore a floppy straw hat tied under her chins with two mufflers. "Who are you anyhow?" Her eyes were slits. "Are you that big gal with the Mary Dowdle?" "That's me," Mrs. Dowdle said. "You want some chestnut dressing? When did you eat last?" "I don't know," Aunt Madge said. "What day is it? And who are these two kids? Are they your grandkids?" "They might be," Mrs. Dowdle said. "I'll have this boy stick some more cobs in your stove," meaning me. "I don't feel the cold," Aunt Madge said. "I'm too old. What's that little gal a-doing?" meaning Ruth Ann. "She's dishing you up some of Wilhelmina Wiedenbach's candied yams for you. But you won't like 'em. They're so sweet they'll set your teeth on edge, if you had any." "Where is my teeth?" Aunt Madge wondered, looking around. She spied Dad pouring out a jar of gravy on the white meat. "Who's that old hoot?" "He's the preacher," Mrs. Dowdle bellowed at her. "What's he here for?" "I brought him to preach your funeral in case you die before you get some eats in you." Ruth Ann stared at that and Dad too. "I ain't dying today," Aunt Madge said. "I'm waiting for Thanksgiving because they're going to bring me my dinner." Aunt Madge managed to put away a lot of dinner, though she had to gum everything. She wanted seconds on everything except the candied yams, and she wanted a double-wide slice of pie. We were all watching her eat when a sound from outside made us jump. Dad dashed for the doorway and hit his head. I followed. It was the sound of the pickle roaring to life, and then the clump of the hood and the bang of a car door. When we looked out, the pickle was wheeling around in the barn lot, throwing gravel. Now it was grunting down the lane and away in a cloud of exhaust. Dad grabbed for his car keys, and they were in his pocket. Somebody had hot-wired our pickle and stolen it out from under our noses. Dad looked real tense. Mrs. Dowdle was behind us in the door. "Bagged him," she said. "This time for sure. I figured he'd be needing another car bad, but he won't get far on an eighth of a tank." She meant Roscoe Burdick. Roscoe Burdick, who'd need wheels because he piled his own car on the Schelleberger steps and sent Phyllis flying. Come to find out, Aunt Madge was Roscoe's grandma. "I counted on temptation overcoming him if we delivered a car to his front door." Mrs. Dowdle sounded about half satisfied. Of course, she hadn't told us this was where Roscoe Burdick lived. Dad and I had to tramp back to the Burma Shave sign on the county road to flag down a ride. In the end, a farmer named Sensenbaugh picked us up and brought us home. Mrs. Dowdle sat in the cab of the truck with him. We Barnharts rode in the truck bed behind, wind whipped all the way back to town. It was really cold back there. Dad held Ruth Ann wrapped in his arms, but he thought it was a great, like a hayride, though her eyes streamed and her nose was as red as Aunt Madge's. She wanted to sing "Come Ye Thankful People Come," trilling it out across the frosty fields. All is safely gathered in ere the winter storm begins. Chapter 13, Selective Service. We got our car back, though it reeked to high heaven of Budweiser and Lucky Strikes, and the ashtray was full. The sheriff of Macon County west of us had pulled Roscoe over on the Lost Bridge Road. So Roscoe was in a pickle in more ways than one. The sheriff over there wouldn't hold him but overnight. C.P. Snokes over here didn't want him that long. Everybody heard, of course. Grounded up in her room, Phyllis heard. Hermits heard. Everybody agreed that Dad wouldn't press charges. With Dad, it had to do with turning the other cheek. But the Macon County Sheriff wouldn't see Roscoe loose in his county. C.P. Snokes had to go over and haul him back. "Bring him directly to my place," Mrs. Dowdle said, and C.P. Snokes did it because it was always easier to do as she said. She told us all Barnharts to come over too, as quick as we saw the police chief's Dodge pull in. Phyllis too, all of us. Ruth Ann was probably already over there. She and Mrs. Dowdle were getting real serious about fruitcakes and nut bread and divinity fudge. It was just evening on that Friday after Thanksgiving. The whole town was eating leftovers when the official Dodge turned in at Mrs. Dowdle's, towing our pickle. "I don't want Phyllis anywhere near that crooked boy," Mother said, but Mrs. Dowdle had been particular about Phyllis coming too. Phyllis was looking pale and washed out, but she was anxious to be with Roscoe in what she called his hour of need, since even the sheriff of Macon County was prejudiced against him. We trooped over there under the suet trees, around the Dodge and the pickle. We went up to Mrs. Dowdle's front door, since this was a formal call. Ruth Ann opened it. Her apron trailed the floor, her braids were tied up, and there was flour on her face. "Ooh, boy," she piped, jerking a small thumb behind her. "They've got the jailbird here. Come on in and wipe your feet." I was kind of hoping Roscoe would be cuffed behind his back. After all, he'd sure truss me up good before he pitched me in the crick. I was still bearing that grudge, and I still am. It was nearly winter, so the parlor stove was up and aglow. I'd never been in Mrs. Dowdle's front room. An old gasolier light fixture hung down. The paper was loose on the walls. Mrs. Dowdle sat in a platform rocker. Her specs reflected red flame from the isinglass window on the stove. C.P. Snokes and Roscoe stood by. Roscoe was still more or less in custody, but sadly not in handcuffs. His sideburns were down to here, and his shirt was unbuttoned down to there. He was gazing away at nothing and chewing something. Maybe gum, maybe not. At this sight of him, Phyllis made a small squeaking sound. A candied cherry smell drifted in from the kitchen. "Doggone it, Mrs. Dowdle," the police chief was saying. "I can't hold him at headquarters overnight without charging him. Anyhow, if I had him to sleep there, he'd dig his way out. You know what those Burdicks is. They're like a passel of chicken-eating raccoons. They can burrow in and burrow out of pretty nearly any place." "Well, if you turn him loose, you better sleep in your Dodge," Mrs. Dowdle remarked, "or he'll hot-wire it out from under you." Roscoe shrugged off this whole conversation. His weird blue and green gaze drifted Phyllis's way. He seemed to have been humming some song just under his breath, and it may have been, "Are you lonesome tonight?" Phyllis quivered. "Mrs. Dowdle," said the police chief, "my hands is tied." Roscoe's hands were on his Levi hips. He could hum, chew, and sneer all the same time. I personally thought he was a free man already. We all did. We were wrong. C.P. Snokes glanced over at Dad. "I doubt if the preacher's going to press charges." "Well," Dad said, "I'm sure the boy is sorry for—" "Nobody around here presses charges against the Burdicks," Mrs. Dowdle proclaimed. "It's the best way I know to get your outbuildings burned down under mysterious circumstances." "Prejudice," Phyllis muttered. "Hush," Mother said to her. "Pure prejudice," Phyllis muttered. C.P. Snokes said, "So my hands is—" "But you might cast your thoughts back to this galoot's 18th birthday," Mrs. Dowdle said. She was smoothing the apron across her mighty knees. Her mouth worked in thoughtful way as she cast her own thoughts back. Roscoe himself seemed to think back to whatever he might have done on his 18th birthday. "What did he do?" the police chief asked. "It's what he didn't do," Mrs. Dowdle replied. A silence fell over us. The smoke sighed up the stovepipe. Late November wind twanged in the lightning rods above. "He didn't register with the draft board," Mrs. Dowdle said, "to serve 2 years in the Army, which is the law, the federal law." Phyllis had been receding into the shadows. She stopped and swayed slightly. Roscoe hadn't done his Army service, like Elvis. He was, what do you call it? "He's a draft dodger," Mrs. Dowdle said. "They can put him away for that." I didn't know who to look at, Roscoe or Phyllis. "Oh, well, shoot," Mrs. Dowdle, C.P. Snokes said. "I have an idea the Army wouldn't even want him. Anyhow, the draft board meets at the county seat. I doubt if any of them citizens on the board ever heard tell of the Burdicks." "Snokes," Mrs. Dowdle said, "do you know who any of them citizens on the board is?" "Well, I don't know as I could put a name to any one of them. They drafted me in 1940, and all that bunch is dead or out of office. I could name you one, Mrs. Dowdle said in a loud, carrying voice. Then an eerie thing happened. We were all there in the circle of orange light around the parlor stove, Phyllis over at the edge. But now a figure was there in the kitchen, in the door to the kitchen. Small, gnomish, and necklace, but there. Ruth Ann's was all eyes. Who wasn't? Come on in, Flora. Mrs. Dowdle waved a hand, and in our midst stepped Miss Flora Schelleberger, Miss Cora's feistier sister. Roscoe wasn't chewing anything now. He swallowed hard. Evening all, Miss Flora said grimly. The same Miss Flora who got her front yard plowed under and her mounting block chipped when Roscoe lost control of his DeSoto and Roscoe Burdick, she said, scanning all the way up him. I've overlooked your case because I didn't want to wish you on the U.S. Army, but I'd be derelict in my duties as chairman of the Selective Service Committee if I left you at large another night. Maybe the Army can make something out of you. You haven't made anything out of yourself except a public nuisance and a danger to young girls and a waste of space. She was a small woman and dried up, and she had no neck to speak of, but she didn't mince words. Roscoe had pretty poor posture, but he drooped more and more and went pale. Even his sideburns looked worried. He reached for his ear, but he'd smoked his last lucky strike. You'll be doing a 2-year hitch for Uncle Sam, beginning with boot camp, Miss Flora said, or you'll be doing 2 years hard time in the federal slammer down in Marion. What's it to be? And bear in mind, I speak as a representative of the federal government in Washington, D.C. and the administration of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Even I noticed that Phyllis's head was swirling. Her own personal Elvis had been a draft dodger, while the real Elvis was serving his country. And looking good in his uniform, Phyllis didn't know what to think, but it was too good a moment to miss. A quick inventory of her every Elvis Presley movie seemed to unreel across her brain. I'll wait for you, Roscoe, she blurted, however long. Just don't be too shook up. Mother sighed. C.P. Snokes was pointing Roscoe at the porch. Love me tender, Phyllis called out with a catch in her voice. Roscoe left on the milk train for the induction center at St. Louis. Miss Flora Schelleberger processed his papers personally. The clerk at the Norfolk and Western Depot flagged down the train and gave Roscoe a free ticket for the chair car, donated by a grateful community. C.P. Snokes put him on the train. Quite a few people stood out on their porches that nippy Saturday morning, gladly seeing Roscoe off. As the train pulled out through town, Mrs. Dowdle herself stood on her front porch, waving Roscoe goodbye with a dish towel in her mighty hand.